What happens when you sew a collared button-up blouse pattern in a heavyweight fabric? You get a shacket. Today I'm sewing and sharing the Juneau blouse pattern by Styla Patterns. I'm sewing it in a heavyweight cotton to create a jacket. Sewing in a material that wasn't intended for the pattern originally makes me feel like I have two patterns in one. For today's sew along, I've chosen the long sleeve option, and I'm using this heavyweight cotton with beautiful earthy tones from Folio Fabrics. I've left a link to the fabric below so you can check out all the details as well as their full line of beautiful fabric choices. I've also left a link to the pattern so you can grab a copy and sew along with me. Let's get started. Take your pocket piece to the ironing board and we're going to fold the top raw edge to the wrong side by 3/4 of an inch. Once you have that pressed, we're going to fold it once more to the wrong side right on top of this fold another 3/4 of an inch and give that a good press. Then we're going to take it to the sewing machine and edge stitch close to this bottom fold all the way across. Now I've taken my pocket back to the ironing board and I pressed in the side edges and the bottom edge to the wrong side by 1/2 of an inch. And then I pressed in the corners so that I could maintain that corner shape. Transfer your pocket placement marking onto your left bodice piece in your preferred method. I'm just going to use pins. Then place your pocket on top of your left bodice piece, aligning the top left corner of the pocket with your pocket placement marking, and then pinning in place along the side and bottom edges. Then take your pocket to the sewing machine and edge stitch along the side and bottom edges of the 1/8 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and at the end to secure. Take your 3/4 inch wide strip of interfacing to the ironing board and apply it to the center front of your left front bodice piece, right along the raw edges, fusing it to the wrong side of the fabric. Then we're going to fold the raw edges of the fabric to the wrong side by 3/4 of an inch, right along the edges of that interfacing, and give that a good press. Once you have that raw edge pressed to the inside by 3/4 of an inch, we're going to press it once again, right on top of itself another 3/4 of an inch, giving that a good press from top to bottom. Then take it to your sewing machine and edge stitch close to this inner fold from top to bottom with a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Now grab your front placket piece and another strip of 3/4 inch wide interfacing, and we're going to fuse this interfacing to the wrong side of the placket piece, again right up against one of the long edges. Here is my right bodice, wrong side facing me. Now I'm going to take the right side of the placket and place the right side onto the wrong side of my bodice piece, so that the uninterfaced edge of my placket meets the raw edge of the bodice, and pin in place. Now with that pinned in place, we're going to take it to the sewing machine and sew the placket to the front bodice from top to bottom with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then open out your placket, press this seam toward the placket. Then once again, we're going to fold and press twice at 3/4 inch increments. Take the raw edge and press it to the wrong side of your placket by 3/4 of an inch and give that a good press. Then fold and press it once more, another 3/4 of an inch from top to bottom. Then we're going to top stitch twice. First, we're going to sew from the top to the bottom of this inner folded edge with a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Then we're going to top stitch the outer folder edge again with a 1/8 inch seam allowance from top to bottom. Here is the top of my back bodice piece. I'm going to fold it in half along this top edge so that I can find the center point and mark it with a pin. Now that that center point is marked with a pin, I'm going to use another pin to mark another point 1 inch away from that pin, and 1 inch away on the other side as well. Now you're going to take the outer pin and fold it to the center pin and pin that pleat in place. And do the same on the other side, bringing that outer pin to the center and pinning in place. Now take it to your sewing machine and sew these pleats in place with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to start attaching our yoke pieces at the shoulder seams to our front bodice pieces. Here is the shoulder seam of one of my front bodice pieces, and I'm going to place one of my yoke pieces right sides together with that shoulder seam and pin in place. Then I'm going to flip this over and grab my other yoke piece and place the right side of this yoke piece on the wrong side of the bodice. And then I'm going to add this to that shoulder pinning through all layers. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, sandwiching my remaining front bodice piece between the yoke pieces and pinning in place through all layers. Then I'm going to take these shoulder seams to the sewing machine and sew through all layers with a 1/2 inch seam allowance on both sides. Now that the shoulder seams are sewn, open out the yokes away from the shirt so that the yokes are now wrong sides together, and give these shoulder seams a good press. Now that our yoke seams are pressed, we're going to take it to the sewing machine and top stitch the yokes on both sides 1/8 of an inch away from the original seam line. Now open out these yoke pieces away from each other. Roll up the front bodice pieces so that they rest on top of the main yoke piece. Now we're going to place our back bodice piece on top of our main yoke piece, the outer yoke, so that the top of the back bodice is right sides together with the bottom of the main yoke, and pin in place all the way across. Now that that's pinned, we're going to roll up our back bodice piece, just like we did for the front bodice pieces, so that they're now sitting together. Take the bottom edge of your inner yoke piece so that the right side of the inner yoke rests on top of the wrong side of the back bodice piece, and add that to your pinning. Now take it to your sewing machine and sew through all 3 layers with a 1/2 inch seam allowance from one end of the yoke to the other. Sew this seam carefully so that you're not catching those rolled up parts of the bodices as you sew. Now that yoke seam is secured, we can pull the rolled up bodice pieces out from inside the yokes. Now that everything is turned right side out, the inside of your shirt should look like this, with the right side of the inner yoke material facing you and the wrong sides of the bodices facing you. And the outside of your garment should look like this, with the right side of your main yoke material and the right sides of your bodice pieces facing you. Now take this bottom yoke seam to your ironing board and give it a really good press. Once it's pressed, we're going to top stitch this yoke seam 1/8 of an inch away from the original seam line, just as we did for the tops of the yoke pieces. Place your collar pieces right sides together and pin together the outer short edges and the top long raw edge. Take it to your sewing machine and sew these collar pieces together along the short edges and the top edge with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now trim those seam allowances by about half, and also clip those corners, being careful not to clip past your stitching. I also like to taper the seam allowances here so I can get a nice point when I turn it right side out. Now turn this collar piece right side out, poking out those corners. Then take that to your ironing board and give the collar a really good press. Once it's pressed, we're going to top stitch along the seams that we just sewed, top stitching with a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Apply your collar stand interfacing to the wrong side of your collar stand lining piece. Once you've applied the interfacing, press the bottom edge of the collar stand to the wrong side by 1/2 of an inch and give that a good press. Find and mark the centers of the collar main and the collar lining pieces. Also find and mark the center of your bodice back yoke pieces. Now take your main collar stand piece and place it right sides together with your back yoke, matching your center pins. Pin in place. Then take that bottom edge of the collar stand piece and match it with the center front, allowing the collar stand to extend 1/2 inch beyond that center front placket, and pin in place. Do the same on the other side. And then you can continue pinning that collar stand piece to the neckline between the points that we've pinned. Now sew the collar stand to the neckline as pinned with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to trim that seam allowance all the way across to about 1/4 inch. And then press that seam allowance up toward the collar stand. Place the bottom raw edges of your collar piece right sides together with the main collar stand piece, matching the center points and pin in place. Continue pinning them together all the way across. Then take your interfaced collar stand piece, layer it on top of these pieces, sandwiching the collar piece between the collar stand pieces, and pin in place all along the top and curved edges of the collar stand, adding it to this pinning. Now we're going to sew through all layers with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, starting from the folded edge of your interfaced collar stand, all the way up and around until you get back to the opposite folded edge of the collar stand. Now we're going to trim this seam allowance to about 1/4 inch. And then turn this collar stand right side out. Give that collar stand seam a really good press. Take the folded bottom edge of your inner collar stand piece that we pressed earlier and place it on top of that collar stand seam line so that it just covers those stitches. And pin in place all the way across. Now with the bottom of the inner collar stand pinned and secured, we're going to top stitch around the entirety of the collar stand, sewing all the way around the collar stand through all thicknesses with an 1/8 inch seam allowance. For the bottom hem of the garment, first we're going to finish these bottom raw edges for the front and back pieces, starting those finishing stitches right where the curve begins at the bottom of the bodice. You can use your serger or a zigzag stitch. Do this for the bottoms of your front bodice pieces, as well as for the bottom of the back bodice piece. Once the bottom edges are serged, take them to the ironing board and fold them to the wrong side by 5/8 inch all the way around the bottom edges of the bodice back, as well as the bottom edges of the bodice front pieces. Then we're going to take these pressed edges to the sewing machine and sew them in place with a 1/2 inch seam allowance for the front and back bodice pieces. Now that our bottom hems are complete, place your front and back bodice pieces right sides together and pin your side seams from the underarm to the top of the hem curve. And do this for both side seams. Sew both side seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then finish your seams. Take your garment to the ironing board and press your side seams on both sides toward the back of the garment. Then we're going to top stitch our side seams in place on both sides using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to clip into the marked notch of the sleeve house piece. Place that pattern piece on top of the fabric and use it as your guide to cut that notch. Repeat for the other sleeve house piece. Now take both of your sleeve house pieces to the ironing board and press the long side edges to the wrong side by 1/2 inch, as well as all of these top short edges, so that your sleeve house pieces now look like this. Then take your sleeve placket pieces to the ironing board and press the top short edges and one long side edge to the wrong side by 1/2 inch, so that your sleeve placket pieces now look like this. Now we'll designate these sets as our right and left placket pieces. Now I'm going to transfer my sleeve placket markings onto the bottom of my sleeves. Do the same thing for your remaining sleeve piece, making sure that you flip your pattern piece to the opposite side so that this placket will be mirrored. Now take a scrap rectangle of interfacing that's just big enough to cover that rectangle that we transferred onto the fabric, and fuse in place. Now that those areas are interfaced, we're going to take it to the sewing machine and sew around the outer lines that we've drawn, reinforcing these rectangles. Now we're going to take our scissors and clip up the center line to the bottom of the triangle. And then we're going to clip into the outermost diagonal lines to the top corners of the rectangles, making sure not to clip through those stitches. These innermost diagonal lines will not be cut. Now grab your right sleeve and your right placket piece. Place the right side of your placket with the wrong side of your fabric, right along that outermost line with that diagonal cut. Align the raw edge of the placket with that center slit and pin in place. Sew along that raw edge of the placket and over the top folded edge using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now trim that seam allowance to 1/4 inch and press that seam allowance toward the placket. Now fold up the longer edge of the bottom of the sleeve so that it's out of the way, and we're going to fold this folded edge of the placket a 1/2 inch so that this folded edge covers this stitching, and give that a good press. Then we're going to take it to the sewing machine and top stitch from the bottom of the sleeve along this long edge of the placket and across the top and back down the opposite long edge with a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Now place your right sleeve house piece right sides together with the wrong side of your right sleeve so that it lays opposite your placket and the raw edge lines up with the center slit. And pin in place. Sew in place from the bottom of the sleeve up and over that top folded edge of the sleeve house with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Trim the seam that we just sewed and press that seam allowance toward the sleeve house. Now we're going to fold from the folded edge of the sleeve house 1 inch and press this new folded edge. Now move your placket out of the way, and we're going to top stitch the side and top edges of the sleeve house with a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Now tuck that placket back underneath the sleeve house, aligning the edge of the sleeve house with the edge of the placket. Then we're going to take it back to the sewing machine and sew a square with an X inside it to reinforce the top of this sleeve house. Fold your sleeve in half right sides together and pin or clip the underarm seam. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish your seam. Grab your outer and lining cuff pieces. Take your lining cuff piece to the ironing board. Take the outer long edge, press it to the wrong side by 1/2 inch to create a memory crease. Now place the long edge of the main cuff piece right sides together with the bottom of the sleeve so that the edge of the cuff extends 1/2 inch beyond the placket. And pin in place. Do the same for the opposite end of the cuff on the opposite side of the placket. And then continue pinning between those anchor pins. Now sew the main cuff to the bottom of the sleeve from one side of the opening all the way around to the other side of the opening with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Trim that seam allowance and press that seam allowance toward the cuff. Now place your cuff lining piece right sides together with the main cuff and pin them together all the way around. Start sewing across that folded edge and all the way around until you sew back across that folded edge on the other side, using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now trim that seam allowance and turn your cuff right side out. Now with that crease that we pressed into the cuff lining earlier folded to the inside, place that fold so that it rests right on top of that cuff stitching line and pin in place all the way across the cuff. Now we're going to sew the cuff in the same way that we sewed the collar stand earlier. We're going to stitch all along the bottom, the sides, and the top with the 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Repeat all of these steps to finish your placket and your cuffs for your other sleeve. Now we're going to start inserting the sleeve into our armhole. Make sure you're inserting the correct sleeve into the correct armhole. The overlapping edge of the slit should be away from the blouse. Place the sleeve right sides together with the shirt, matching the underarm seams, and pin in place. And pin all the way around. Do this to insert both of your sleeves and then sew them in place using a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then finish your seams. The cuff buttonholes will be sewn into the side of the cuff that overlaps the other. You're going to sew the buttonhole right in the middle of the cuff, starting the buttonhole stitches 3/8 of an inch from the outer edge of the cuff. I'm going to mark those starting points with a pin on both cuffs, and then sew those buttonholes in place. Then we're going to sew a buttonhole into the collar stand, sewing the buttonhole onto the right side of the blouse. My collar stand buttonhole will be 3/8 of an inch from the edge. I'm only going to sew my collar stand buttonhole horizontally, and I'm going to sew my main buttonholes vertically. Each of the main buttonholes should be about 2 to 2.5 inches apart from each other, starting that distance from your collar stand buttonhole. You can mark those placements now. Now I'll take this right placket to the sewing machine and sew all of my buttonholes. Now the very last step is to place the right placket over the left, lining up the two center fronts so that you can mark where you want your buttons to go. I'm just going to mark my button placements onto the left bodice piece, just using pins. Also overlap that outer edge of the cuff over the inner edge, and mark those buttonholes as well. And then sew all your buttons in place. And now your project is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you check out my other videos for more great sewing inspiration, and I'll see you in the next video.